All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we have a special event. It's a debate that our mutual friend Marvin Wallace originally set up, and he was going to be moderating, but apparently he forgot. So I'm going to be playing a dual role here, kind of debating my guest as well as being the moderator. But first things first, let me just introduce who the interlocutor is going to be. So it is the atheist Darren Lute from Skeptics and Seekers. So yeah, Darren, if you want to take a couple minutes, maybe just kind of introduce the audience as to who you are and where you're coming from and stuff like that, so they can get to know you.
Sure. I'm a atheist that's never been a Christian, and have a fairly strong background in the sciences. My first degree was anthropology, figuring out how religions evolved over time, and now I'm do some programming from time to time, um, and occasionally hang out on the some of these religious podcasts.
Gotcha. Okay, and out of curiosity, I know that you mentioned you studied various religions and stuff like that. But you do seem like you're most prominent on places that focus on Christianity. Is there a reason why like you kind of focus your most of your attention on Christianity, or are you out there on other boards like talking about Islam or other religions as well?
For me, talking about how the unicorn horn spirals on any particular religion isn't all that interesting. Mine is more of how they evolved over time. But no, the reason I spend most of my time on Christianity is because I live in a Christian in a in an American. It's still like 60 or 70% Christian. So and the Christians are the ones that are trying to make laws that um, force their religion on everyone else. So that's why I speak out against Christianity mostly.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. Well, basically, I think at this point, the audience knows who you are. And what we're doing today, it's going to be an actual debate or and discussion on the topic of the scientific method or science itself. Which worldview does best supports that or grounds the scientific method? Is it theism or is it atheism? And on that front, I think the first thing to do is kind of let's each give kind of an opening statement, about 10 minutes or so. Again, I'm not strict on the time, but yeah, Darren, as you're the guest, I'll be happy to give you the first word if you want to give kind of your opening on why do you think the scientific method is best grounded by the atheist worldview?
Okay, well, I don't actually think that, because atheism's not really a worldview. Atheism is just a conclusion to one question: is there a God? And that conclusion can be either a solid no, there isn't, or it can be more of a um, as far as I can tell, there isn't type of conclusion. Um, However, since by grounding you mean provides a foundation to explain um, and provide justification or warrant for thinking that it's a good tool in providing us with knowledge, I don't think theism provides that grounding either. I don't think it can provide that grounding. Um, so if I was to give my pitch for the scientific method, I would say that the reason we have a justification or warrant for thinking that the scientific method is a good tool for providing us with knowledge is because in the past, as we've used it, as we've compared it to reality, because the only thing that really matters is what reality thinks, not what anyone else thinks, is that it works. If you want to build a rocket to go to the moon, you don't go to and pray to a god. You don't go and um, come up with some great argument or anything else, you go out and build a rocket. If the rocket flies, then that's reality telling you that you did it correctly. And if it doesn't fly for whatever reason, then that's reality telling you that you got it wrong. And that's the that's our main justification for thinking that it can provide us with knowledge, because it does. We ask reality by building the rocket if we did it correctly, and reality tells us yes, you did. And we can do that with all the different sciences. There's an example in evolutionary science where they they were looking for a specific transition between fish and land animals. And so they figured it, because of the theory, it had to have certain features, and that they should find it in a specific level of rock. And so they went out and searched in that specific level of rock and um, found exactly what they were expecting to find. And that's how you know when you really have knowledge, when you can predict something that you don't know, predict where it is, how to find it, and predict what it should look like. And then you go out and you find it. And in this case, reality told them they were right.
Thank you for that. So, and just to clarify, so your opening position in terms of like atheism as the grounding for the scientific method, you're kind of coming across and saying, well, look, my position is I'm not making a claim on that front because we know that science works. That's enough. Atheism isn't a worldview that is grounding science. Is that so? Like, there's no argument for atheism on this front. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't think a worldview can ground the truth of science. I don't even know how saying that a worldview grounds science is even a coherent statement, quite honestly.
Gotcha.
Because you don't, in science, you don't, I mean, it doesn't matter what your worldview, you can still do science whether you're a theist, atheist, pastafarian, whatever. And it doesn't change because of your worldview, how you do science. So I
Gotcha.
don't even know what it means to say that a worldview grounds science.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So, also, I'm going to make the attempt then to show how I think a theistic worldview is the best grounding for science and the scientific method on that front. But just for explaining everything that Darren said, like I didn't even bother taking notes because I agree with him on the scientific method. It is an extremely useful tool, probably one of the best tools that we have for gaining knowledge. And it's a good thing that it makes predictions. And then, you submit a hypothesis, it makes predictions, and then you can go out and confirm are those predictions true or false. All of that I'm going to be agreeing with. But let's get into the question of grounding. So let me bring up my slides here. All right. Stage. And that's showing up, right? My slides there.
Yes, they are.
Okay, so a little bit of humor. So it's a time to refute Darren Lute. That's kind of a saying I always have here, but let's get serious here. So, okay, so the first thing I want to distinguish is that there is other disciplines beyond science for understanding truth, and there are disciplines that actually can speak above and be authoritative to the science as a discipline. So, in order to understand that, there's a difference between science versus the philosophy of science. So, what is science? So, science, it just stems from the Latin word scientia, which simply means knowledge, right? Originally, it's a way to gain knowledge. And in the 1600s, science was actually a subdiscipline in philosophy. It was called natural philosophy. right? So it was engaging in the philosophical discipline, um, looking at the natural world. And the goal was to gain knowledge, which, again, knowledge is the field of epistemology, which is a philosophical subdiscipline. So it just from the origins of science, it does seem that philosophy is really the main discipline. Science is just something within the field of philosophy. And science, as understood today, it still refers to a specific field, or to be more specific, fields of study, again, related to the natural world, how it typically operates in accordance with natural laws. And the thing here is that science is known as what's called a first order discipline, right? So it's kind of what Darren was describing. It gets the boots on the ground, and it asks descriptive questions and deals with descriptive features about the natural world. So it asks questions: what is a covalent bond? What is it that makes an ecosystem stable? How does DNA replicate? Are to bring in my favorite, the shroud. Are the shroud images, body and bloodstain images, composed of paint or not? These are first order descriptive questions, and that's what science as a methodology is geared towards answering. However, it's philosophy that is a second order discipline. It's such because it studies and evaluates the assumptions, presuppositional foundations, methods, and argument forms of all the other first order disciplines, including science. And the way philosophy does that is by applying logic. And again, logic is a first order subdiscipline within philosophy first. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that it's the philosophy of science which asks the normative questions, those second order questions. What ought, by normative, we're saying what ought science look at? What ought the scientific method be, in terms of the proper scientific method? What qualifies? How do observational data confirm a scientific hypothesis or not? And Darren mentioned predictions. Okay, well that's engaging in, not in science, but in the philosophy of science, where we're saying in order for it to be good science, a hypothesis has to make predictions. That's a philosophical statement. So the point that I'm trying to get here is that it's really philosophy that stands above science and judges science as a discipline. And because of this, it is philosophers, not the scientists themselves, who are trained and equipped to answer the higher order questions about science itself. The scientists, they're only authorities within their lower order questions, or their lower order subdisciplines, right? In biology or cosmology, whatever that is. They're not qualified as experts to speak to the philosophical normative questions. And this also brings us to an issue where there's the two different main views in terms of how to view the philosophy of science. And I know Darren, he's expressed, if I've understood him correctly, and he can correct me in this when we go to the discussion, but I think that Darren takes what's called the internal philosophy of science view, or the IPS position. And this is the view that, look, philosophy is really just kind of every other discipline is kind of a subdiscipline of science. It's science that's the god of all academic disciplines. Science is it's justified, or epistemically justified on its own warrants. There's no foundations that involve other things. We can just take science or the scientific method as a given, and that it's justified. It can't be questioned or evaluated from a higher viewpoint. And the authority to inform or to convey knowledge is strictly a one-way street from science to other studies. If there's a contradiction or a competition, if a historical proposition or philosophy conclusion contradicts science, we always go with what the conclusion from science says. So this is what's known as the internal philosophy of science position. And I would say, well, this is probably the most popular view among atheist scientists today. Really, in the field, among philosophers of science and logicians and philosophers, they know better. This view has been refuted in the first place because it's self-refuting, right? You can't prove scientifically or empirically prove that the internal philosophy of science view is correct. So it's self-refuting, but it also has other issues, right? It's question begging because in this case, science, the foundations of science are just assumed to be justified without actually doing the work to logically justify them. And it's just obviously implausible, right? Because it reduces second order normative type questions like what ought the proper scientific method be. It reduces it to a descriptive first order question, which it clearly isn't. So those are some of the problems, and that's why I go for what's called the external philosophy of science position. And this, like I said, represents the mainstream scholarship position within philosophy or the philosophy of science today. And it says that science itself can and in fact is an object of study. Other disciplines can be utilized to evaluate the scientific discipline, such as philosophy with the philosophy of science. But in another case, look, in the history of science, in that case, history would be informing the scientific discipline and speaking to the historical development of science as a method or as a discipline and stuff like that. So other disciplines, it's a two-way street. Other disciplines can inform scientists, and science can inform the other disciplines. That's called a complementary view. So yeah, I have an example there. I don't with falsification. Me and Darren kind of went over that a bit, so I just gave that as an example. So, for example, the principle of falsification. This is something that Darren mentioned in his opening, right? We have this. You have a hypothesis, and it's supposed to make testable predictions, which, in theory, if we test for something that a hypothesis predicts, and we don't observe the predicted consequent, then that falsifies the hypothesis. This is known in science as the principle of falsification, and it's a part of the scientific method. But this is actually philosophy. The principle of falsification it's pure logic and philosophy. It's based on the deductive argument pattern known as denying the consequent, whereby if P is true as the antecedent, then we would predict Q would be true. We in fact observe that not Q is the case. Therefore, we know that P is false, that the hypothesis is false. And this is pure philosophy going back to Plato and Aristotle, guys. It's known as denying the consequent. So the main point here that I want you to get with this slide is that the EPS view better reflects reality, whereby it's philosophy that's the normative discipline, and science, while it is a useful, extremely useful knowledge gathering tool, at least with respect to the higher order questions, science is subservient to philosophy or the philosophy of science specifically on these normative questions. So yeah, okay. So here's another philosophical issue. What I mentioned that science studies the natural world and features according to the laws of nature. Now, there's a question here, and I should have corrected this a little bit because part of my slides here are for another presentation I did on the Shroud on another podcast. So, but there is this question, right? What are the laws of nature? That's a higher order philosophical question. Science can't answer that. And do these laws allow for supernatural events? Do they allow for a god and stuff like that? Well, this is a purely philosophical debate, and there are different philosophical positions about the nature of the laws of nature. The nature of what the laws of nature constitute. So, in the first place, a lot of atheists will go for this view, the gnomic necessity theory, whereby they say, look, the laws of nature are prescriptive. You'll have someone like Stephen Hawking in his book, because there is a law of gravity, as though the law of gravity can exist. It's an independent existing thing that exists independently, and it prescribes or imposes itself on the universe and physical things in the universe. Well, there are other views. I disagree with that view, right? There's something called regularity theory, which just says What are the laws of nature? They aren't things that exist. They can't prescribe anything on the universe. They're merely generalized mathematical descriptions of the way things happen in the universe under ordinary conditions. And that, right? They're describing the regularities, what happens regularly in the universe, all else being equal. Or there's a third position, the causal dispositions theory, whereby they say, well, look, certain things like subatomic particles or whatever have dispositions to cause certain effects and stuff like that. If they're in this situation, they're disposed to cause this, right? If water is in an environment where it's 0 degrees Celsius or below, it is disposed to become solid, to freeze. So my main point here is that, look, there are different views on the laws of nature itself, and this is a pure philosophical debate. This would not be scientists would not be qualified to, as scientists, to answer or adjudicate on this question. Okay, so here's where I get to the main crux of the argument, where I think that theism is a better fit than atheism in terms of explaining science and scientific methodology. And this is what I want to focus the discussion on after I give Darren time to question me. But it's the foundations, philosophical foundations of science and of the scientific method. Without, for scientists, you just have to assume these things are correct or that they're in place in order for science to get off the ground. Without these philosophical questions being answered philosophically, science can't even get off the ground. So, what are some of these scientific foundations that I think theism better fits, right? So, in the first place, science is grounded in mathematics a lot of time, like physics and cosmology. And this presupposes the existence of mathematical numbers in one form or another, and the mathematics' inherent ability to describe and predict the physical universe. So yeah, that's the first thing that you have to get. There's also the laws of logic, right? If the logical law of non-contradiction is false, then most of science, and I would argue even all of science, including quantum physics, can't even get off the ground. Um, there's also the existence of a theory independent yet orderly external world. This is known as the realist position, the existence of the external world. That's a question that can only be answered philosophically, and that is just assumed in the case of science. There's the problem of induction and the uniformity of nature that are assumed. Our ability to gain knowledge, right? Our cognitive and sensory faculties, and Darren kind of mentioned this, that for him it's all about pragmatics. If it works, then it's good. But I'll be raising an objection. Well, sometimes things could work, especially within evolution. Things could work, but that doesn't mean they're aimed towards truth or gaining knowledge necessarily. So something could be false. We could, evolution could support false beliefs, and that's beneficial for our survival. So we don't even need knowledge, kind of thing. And then, we also assume the adequacy of language to describe the world and stuff like that. And then finally, 7, the existence of normative values. So when we're testing theories, why should scientists test? Why ought they test these theories fairly? Why not manipulate the data and report false results and stuff like that just to boost their careers and make themselves look cool? There's that normative question. That's pure philosophy. Why ought scientists behave and report their experiments and their results ethically? And I think on all 7 of these things, grounding these assumptions and relating it to the existence of God makes much more sense. On atheism, there really is no reason to presuppose any of these assumptions. So that's it for my presentation there. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. And oops, I'll remove that. But yeah, there we go. That's kind of my opening presentation on that front. So I guess I'll open it up to kind of an informal dialogue at this part. And first, I'll start with you, Darren, if you want to, since I'm the only one that kind of presented a positive argument. Do you have any questions or any points that you wanted to discuss with me based on that?
Oh, there's so much.
You're looking.
I think part of the problem we're going to have is that we just look at science differently, the two of us, because the reality is that science is philosophy 2.0, just like chemistry is alchemy 2.0. So when you say that philosophy does this or that or this other thing, what you're saying, really saying, is that a sort of an inferior version of philosophy has the rights to tell the better version of philosophy how to work and how to act, and that the better version of philosophy can't actually do the work that it's designed to do. And I think that's going to be that may be just something that we're not going to be able to get past. So there's a lot of the stuff that you went over just doesn't qualify in my view, because the assumptions that you're making just don't match. Um,
Okay, well let me so on that first point, I guess I would just respond like what why do you assume so what my understanding of your argument here is that look there's philosophy 1.0, right, the things that Plato and stuff like that did, but then there's science which is really in real it's philosophy 2.0. We took all of the good bits of philosophy that became science, all of the bad bits remained in what we call philosophy today. But why would we assume that? Like it seems to me like all of the good bits, there are lots of good bits still in philosophy. So for example,
well, I mean,
logic.
it's not like science took the good bits away from philosophy. It just took the good bits that philosophy had and added to that different ways to distinguish fact from fiction, and then called it science. So, like logic, that's not just a philosophy thing, that's a science thing too, because science took the tools of logic and used it as part of their methodology.
So that's correct, right? Science takes logic, which is part of philosophy, as a presupposition.
Well,
So
it's a tool that philosophy uses, and it's also a tool that science uses.
okay, well I would argue like logic was originally part of philosophy, right? So
Yes, I would agree with that, and that's what I'm saying. Science took the tools that the good tools that philosophy uses and made it part of its own.
okay. Well, let me. Okay, so here's my next kind of question for you on that. Then, so are you saying that only that all of the good bits are only exist in science? Are there any good bits in philosophy that science didn't adopt, but that philosophy has, or any other discipline for that matter, has that is good in terms of good? I think you mean obtaining knowledge and stuff like that. In terms of obtaining.
Well, science is focused on discovering how reality works. Um, I know a lot of philosophers will say that, or at least theist philosophers will say that that there's separate magisteria for different things. But the reality is that if we can observe something, if we can experience something, then science is there to help us figure out how that observation or experience interacts with reality. Um, and there is really no separate magisteria for that. It's just anything that we can observe or experience. It'll take from anything, because scientists are very practical people. They want to know how reality works. And so if logic is a tool that they can use to do that, then they'll take logic. If there's something somewhere else that works to help them discover how reality works, then they'll take that tool as well.
Okay. Okay. So you're kind of saying science as a discipline is open to adopting any and all methods. Like there are no limits to what qualifies as science proper.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like because if you want to get a rocket to the moon, you're going to use a lot different methods to do that than, say, figure out how the brain works, or figure out social problems, or whatever tools they need to get the job done, they'll take and use.
Okay, and just to clarify what I was talking about in terms of limits, right? Like, so for example, I would say that science is inherently limited in that it restricts itself by definition to studying the natural world. So if there is a supernatural event, at least it could be argued. I disagree with this, but I think you agree with this that yeah, science can't pronounce on a supernatural event just by definition because
No, I don't agree with that.
okay, okay.
Because, like I said, anything that can be experienced or observed, science has a say in. If that something is supernatural, then yeah, science is all over it.
Okay. Okay. So let's kind of maybe I should bring up my slides again and just kind of let's go over each of these seven things that I think are better explained by theism and stuff. So we mentioned logic, right? So independent of the question, okay, well, is logic a part of philosophy or is it a part of science or is it a part of both? Look, at the end of the day, logic is going to underpin all disciplines, all truth or knowledge gathering disciplines, right? So if there is a discipline that's not employing the laws of logic, you can be dismissed. You're not going to get us knowledge or what we want. You're not going to work, to put it in your terms. Now, okay, so if laws of logic have to be presupposed by these disciplines, on your view, so I can explain where do the laws of logic come from a theistic perspective. They are grounded in God because God
Right. Well,
is
you can make the story of how that happens, but you still haven't demonstrated that that's an accurate description of what happens.
well. I'm trying to appeal to abductive reasoning and inference to the best explanation. Where okay, we can. Here's the hypothesis proposal, right? God exists, and he's got this fundament. He's fundamentally, essentially logical by nature. If that's true, then okay, that would explain why the laws of logic are universally necessary for all academic disciplines, whether science, philosophy, history, whatever.
Right, but I understand that. But the problem is that you can make an infinite number of stories of what grounds logic, and so it's not. The problem is that we have different understandings of what an explanation is, because I don't see God as an explanation, because I don't see that it actually explains anything. All it is an assertion that says God grounds this. It doesn't say how, it doesn't say what you can expect from that, it doesn't say anything else. All it is just an assertion. And I don't understand how an assertion that can be a better explanation than anything else, any other assertion.
Okay, so I have a couple things. I'm gonna forget it, but I guess I'll just respond one at a time. But okay, so it isn't dark energy kind of just an assertion. It's there to
Mm,
explain a
no, it's
fact, right?
not.
Okay.
No, dark energy is a measurement. We measure extra stuff in the universe because we've got formulas that we think are accurate at actually measuring how heavy quote unquote heavy the universe is. And we can sort of add up all the visible matter that we have, and we come up with problems um, with the results, because what we can see doesn't explain all the gravity that we're measuring. And so the dark matter and dark energy are just placeholder words. We know they exist. We know something exists there because we can measure it. We know it exists, but we have absolutely no clue what it is. And so that's where all the hypotheses come in about what it is and what could be possibly causing it. And then we go into the experiments to ask reality, okay, which hypothesis, which theory, which understanding or idea is the accurate one. So the whole thing that undergirds science is asking reality, which hypothesis, which idea did we come up with is correct.
Now, when you say we measure, dark energy or dark matter and stuff like that. You mean based on the expand, we can measure and calculate the expansion rate of the universe, and we can measure the observable normal matter and energy and realize it's insufficient, right? But we're not actually
No,
measuring
it's
or
no,
observing.
it's an actual measurement.
Okay.
And I don't okay, so I don't really understand how they measure it. It has to do with uh, it has to do with how they're detecting gravity, how much gravity they're detecting, how much um, they add up all the mass of um, the visual things. They're measuring more mass in the universe than actually um, they can see, and that's where it comes in from. They don't actually know whether it's actual quirk of how gravity works, or whether it's actual mass that we just can't see, or what's going on with it.
Okay, got it. Okay, so I'll put that aside then. If it is an actual measurement, then fair enough. Okay, but okay, so the next thing on the laws of logic that you said that I want to probe on is you mentioned that there could be, and I assume you mean equally probable, just a priori, explanations that don't involve theism for the universality of the laws of logic. Do, do you mind just naming like what are some of these atheistic options that would account equally explain or account for the laws of logic if true?
Well, what do you mean by equally explain? Because I don't think God actually explains anything. So are you just thinking ideas of different ways it could
Okay.
happen, or are you um,
Okay, so that's a good point. Yeah, so okay, so that was the other thing I wanted to ask. Thanks for reminding me. So that okay, so you said we define explanation differently. So yeah, I define explanation in the basic straightforward logical sense, right? Like if an antecedent conditions are present or postulated to be present as a hypothesis does, okay, we can make an if then hypothetical syllogism, right? Like if this antecedent is the case, then it predicts that the consequent would be true. In that case, the antecedent is sufficient to bring about the predicted effect or the predicted consequent. And that's what I mean by explain. It can account for why the consequent exists. In this case, the consequent being the universality of the laws of logic.
right? But you keep saying it explains, but I still don't understand what it explains. How do you get from a God to logic? I mean, what is it about in the Christian Bible that says that um, God does this because, and this is how he does it, and this is what we can expect from it, and if we do this experiment, it will, that's a natural extension of this that we can go ahead and see if it works or not. I mean, what exactly does saying God grounds logic? How does that explain anything?
Okay. Now, when you're asking for, you asked for like a Bible verse. Was that just off the cuff, or are you
Yeah,
asking?
I mean, I don't care about what the Bible actually says, but the I'm just trying to figure out. You're saying that
So, okay.
having a God explains the laws of logic, and I'm trying to understand what exactly does God explain. Um,
Okay. So
because as far as I can tell, logic is nothing more than the description we give of how reality works.
yeah, yeah. I mean, logic is. I would say the laws of logic are descriptions as well as to how the reality works and that sort of thing. And we can ask what grounds that the fact that reality is bound by what these descriptive descriptions and stuff, right? And I would say, in terms of explanations on theism, right? I'm saying here's my hypothesis: if God exists as it, and he by God he is an essentially logical by nature, and he is the one who created and designed our universe, right? He under the God hypothesis, he is the creator of the universe. That perfectly and sufficiently entails that we would have the universality of these laws of logic describing how reality works. That makes
Right,
sense.
but you don't need a God to have reality. The so you don't actually need a God to have, Because if reality is what actually grounds the laws of logic, because reality is what the laws of logic are actually explaining, then you don't actually need a God in that equation, right? All you need is reality.
Okay, but why? So on the atheistic one, though, I think it's improbable relative to the theistic one. Why would it be the case that the laws of logic would be able to describe universally all of reality and apply to all disciplines? Why wouldn't it be chaotic and stuff? There's no reason why it couldn't be a mixture or, okay, some parts of the universe are illogical and other parts are logical and stuff like that. The universality seems to, in my opinion, it makes it more probable that there's some kind of purposefulness or intent behind applying the laws of logic.
Well, the problem with that is that saying that a God did it is that it's kind of self-defeating, because if you're saying that the universe is logical and therefore there has to be an explanation for it, then you'd also have to say that God is logical, therefore there's an explanation for it. So
There
the
there is
problem you're
actually.
running into is that you're not actually adding anything to
Sorry.
um, the idea that reality exists, and it has some characteristics that we call logic that equally apply to it. Because then you'd have, because you can say the same thing about your God. Your God exists, and it has things that you can say are equally applied to it. And then you either have to say, well, God just is. He's just a brute fact, a necessity. Or you can say that reality just is a brute fact or necessity. I don't see how adding a God is a better explanation, especially when you can't even demonstrate that the God is like a real possibility to begin with.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, obviously, if you are saying you can falsify the God hypothesis, we would debate that and
Well,
stuff
it's
like
not
that.
my job to falsify your claim that a God exists.
Okay. So this is kind of our debate on that, the principle of falsification, right? So it may, it's not my job to prove that my hypothesis is true or even plausible or possible,
Yeah, it kind of
right?
is if you're the one that's making the claim.
But it's a hypothetical, and it's saying if this is the case,
Right,
then
but that's not an explanation. A hypothetical is not an explanation.
correct, it's a conditional statement, right? But it allows us to see the explanation because of the laws of logic itself are entailing the truth, right? Because if the antecedent is true, then that is sufficient to entail the truth of the consequent, right?
Right, but
That's
that if there's doing a lot of work. I mean, that's a big
sure.
thing. If if the flying spaghetti monster is real, then there's a lot of things we can do from that. But that doesn't mean that just because the laws of logic exist doesn't mean that your if statement is even plausible or even possible to begin with.
Right, but in terms of so there's no problem with doing the same for the flying spaghetti monster or anything else. Look, if relativity theory is true, we would predict gravitational waves or lensing and stuff like that, right? But when Einstein said that, that if was making a lot of stuff, was bearing a heavy load. It wasn't until
Right, but there's a big difference between what you're doing and what Einstein did. One, Einstein didn't just have a concept that he couldn't demonstrate was real or even possible. He came to his understanding through observable facts of the universe, figured out the math behind. Well, he didn't personally figure out the math behind it, but used the math that we knew was accurate about the universe, extracted that out, came to the conclusion of relativity, and then they didn't just accept that relativity was true at that point. No science ever does. Just because you have an idea doesn't mean it's um, it's automatically true. They had to then take the next step and test out before they even uh, uh, started to take it seriously. Test out to make sure that it actually did what they thought was going to do, and then they made other predictions that they didn't know about based on that to verify that what they were doing was actually true. So to say that you and Einstein are doing the same thing is not entirely accurate, because you haven't based God on anything that any sort of math that we know is true. You haven't based God on anything other than just general argumentation. So in a scientific sense, all you have really is an idea. You don't even have really have a hypothesis yet. So, um,
Well, hypotheses don't need to be grounded in math, right?
well, not necessarily math, but they need to be grounded in something that's we know already to be true.
Okay, but we do have these observations. We are exactly the same as Einstein, right? Those observations I've read about how he basically just did a thought. He was doing philosophy. He did thought experiments in his head, and that's how he came up with his notion.
Well, that's how
Physics,
he came up with the idea, sure, and then he turned it into a hypothesis by doing the math.
okay, so okay, so again, you said the mathematics is not required for a hypothesis. There are plenty of hypotheses that aren't grounded in mathematics, right? So
Right, but that was Einstein's path,
that was
was through the math.
Einstein's. Yeah, so he did some mathematics to try and prove on his end, okay, is my hypothesis plausible mathematically speaking? And that's because he had a physics. So that brings us to point number one, which is kind of similar here. But okay, so the existence of mathematical numbers then. Again, same argument I would make to God, but on atheism, I don't see why should, and this Albert Einstein was impressed by this fact itself, the rational intelligibility of the universe. Why can we describe the physical universe and it corresponds to mathematical numbers? Where does that
Well, it's
come?
because we created the language of numbers to describe the universe. It would actually be more surprising if it didn't.
Okay, so mathematics is totally invented. It's not discovered. This is a debate within the philosophy of mathematics, right? But
Well,
so
it
it's
depends on what you mean by invented or discovered. We observed the universe. We abstracted out the concepts of numbers to describe that universe. So whichever way that goes, that
okay.
means invented or discovered.
Okay, so two things then I'll say. Not so number one, why again the universality of the applicability of mathematics to the universe as a whole? Why wouldn't we observe various patches where it would be this chaos? It's the same question I asked with the logic, right? Like what it just so happens, yeah, the entire universe, no matter which direction you look, where how far you go out, there the whole universe is always governed by mathematics.
Well, it's
Um,
not governed by
or
mathematics.
described
It's
by
governed by the laws that the universe works under, and we describe those laws through mathematics.
right. But like why isn't it patchy? You know what I'm saying? Like under atheism, why couldn't um why certain sections of the universe be governed by mathematics, not governed, described by mathematics or correspond to mathematical descriptions, other parts not.
Well, I mean, you
Um,
can ask the same thing as why not under God, because there's no reason that God has to make everything.
sure there
Uh,
is. Sure there is.
I
Yeah,
mean, we're talking about a God that can create miracles. So, under your hypothesis, the fact that we see everything as all ordered all the time is actually a point against your God, because your God does miracles. So, we would actually expect to see non ordered things every once in a while through just because God is doing miracles.
well, no, that's not true because so it
Well,
is
that's the
true.
prediction I'm making out of it. And so if
Okay, well
there's a prediction of your God that, uh,
let me
I mean,
just let me respond. So, okay, so you are correct that under the God hypothesis, right? If God, the God that I'm having, is true and exists, and we would predict, yeah, he does do miracles. That's a part of prediction, but it's not to the extent that you're saying, because the God hypothesis actually predicts that we would have regularities and a universe that's describable in ways we can understand in terms of mathematical numbers and stuff like that. That's actually predicted because that's what we as creatures need to thrive, to not only survive but to thrive and to live out our lives as image bearers of God, where we can learn and grow in our understanding of the universe. If miracles, random supernatural events were happening all the time and there were no regularities to help us distinguish such events for specified purposes, it would be interpretational chaos, as you're saying, and that is not predicted by the God hypothesis. He would not want
Well,
creatures
you
being in
say
chaos.
the God hypothesis, but it's really your God hypothesis because you're making up this idea of a God that meets all these criteria, that is logical and consistent, and you're not doing it because you started with the God and went to what you would expect the universe to react from or to display. You're starting with what the universe actually is and describing your God from that. So yes, if you start with the universe as we see it, and then you create the idea of your God to match that description, then yes, you are going to have a God that predicts that. But that's kind of meaningless because you haven't even demonstrated that a God is even possible to begin with yet.
Well, in the first place, so that's what you said we're supposed to do. That's what Einstein did. We're supposed to look out and observe certain features of the universe and then
Right, but
take that into
Einstein,
account.
no, Einstein didn't work. See, this is the problem with, um, and I'm not directing this at you. It's just sort of in general. But
Yeah.
this is the problem that don't have with people who don't have a scientific background. They don't actually understand how the scientific process works. When a when a person has an idea, I mean, you're right, they do see what's going on and they have this idea of this regularity that's happening and they make this idea out of it. But they don't really stop there. They don't say if my idea is right, then we should expect to see all the stuff that I'm seeing and made this hypothesis from. What they do is the next step is they take reality. In Einstein's case, it was all the math of the observations of the expansion of the universe and Hubble's constant and all that. And all of that had been tested to be accurate through observation, experimentation, predictions, and he took that knowledge that we had and he created a hypothesis, a mathematical model that reflected what he was seeing, that reflected what his idea was. And because his idea um, was consistent with his mathematical model, I mean, I'm sure he had to make some changes up to his idea based off of what the math was telling him. But
Yeah.
that's the thing is that he was changing his idea based off what the math was telling him. And then he didn't stop there because that was just a hypothesis. He then went and made predictions of what he would find that he did things he didn't know about already if his math was accurate. And that's what led to the hypothesis um, being that grounding of truth for that his hypothesis was the predictions that he was making of the knowledge that we didn't know about. It wasn't that he just came up with an idea and we all fell over it. It was that he went through all the trouble of actually testing his idea, showing that his idea was even possible to begin with. And you haven't even the
Didn't show
I
that it
don't,
was
I don't want to
possible.
say you, but the theists haven't even gotten past the point of the idea even being possible. You still got a long way to go before you can start making grand claims about God being the grounding of reality.
Okay, so I would just dispute the fact we theists have gone a lot better than just proving God is not only possible but proving that He actually exists. Now, obviously, we disagree on those arguments and stuff like that, and that's a
Well,
debate. Does God
except
exist?
arguments aren't evidence. They're not proof of anything.
Well, they are if they're sound arguments, right? So
Well, yeah, but you haven't demonstrated any of them are sound.
again, we disagree on that, right? But I'm trying to avoid getting into a debate on the existence of God. Just, I mean, we can get into it if you insist and stuff. But in terms of today's topic, I'm just trying to make an abductive argument for God's existence based on it's exactly what Einstein did. Again, you've admitted that proving I guess the possibility of a thing using mathematics is not necessary. Charles Darwin did no math
Well,
in trying to show
he
his
didn't.
height. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, but he didn't prove he didn't prove it through the math. He proved that it was possible through the math, and then it was the experimentation and the uh, novel testable predictions that he
Okay.
made that ended up being correct that actually proved his math was accurate.
Okay, but I'm trying to say that they do we do theists do that all the time, but the mathematics is irrelevant. That's just the means through which Einstein did it. But Charles Darwin didn't use math to prove the possibility of his evolutionary theory. So it's not necessary for a hypothesis to be proven possible through mathematics or something. That so we can put that aside, right? That's just something that is relevant to Einstein's case. But in terms of everything else is exactly the same that the theists are doing, right? We
No, it's not.
observe certain phenomena in the universe, just like Einstein observed certain phenomena. We come up in our heads with a hypothesis. Albert Einstein, read the history of it. He literally thought this stuff in his head. What a
No, what
philosopher that guy
see
was,
that
right?
that's not accurate. You're not coming up with a hypothesis, you're coming up with an idea. You haven't actually reached the hypothesis stage yet if we're talking scientific lingo.
Okay, and that's a dispute in the philosophy of science. Actually, what is a hypothesis? When does it qualify as one? So, okay, I'll take your point. Finally, he came up with an idea. Um, I would say that's what a hypothesis is. That's just a difference in definitions, whatever. Okay, great. And then they submitted that, and then they made certain predictions, right? And theists can do that too. So, for example, on this basis, I would predict if God exists as I've defined him, and you're also correct. Okay, certain God concepts can't explain the facts as we see them. Great, they've been falsified, but the concepts of God that I'm supposing do adequately account for these things. And furthermore, I would predict look, even in further areas of the universe that we have not even seen, they will be describable in terms of mathematical things and they will be consistent with the laws of logic. That was a prediction, back in the early 20th century. We knew nothing. We didn't even know that there were other galaxies out there and stuff, right? Okay, we discovered a heck of a lot. And guess what? Predictions confirmed. Yep, the rest of the universe is everywhere we look. It's mathematically consistent
Well,
and
we
it's
don't
consistent with the
actually
laws
we
of
don't
logic.
actually know that actually. That's a base assumption that scientists make. It's not something that we've proven to be true, and it's also not something that was made based off of predictions made up based off of theism. It's actually made those predictions are made off of for the math that does the expansion of the universe.
What? No, no, it's not based on the math. Okay, so sorry. Again, we're trying to say that the universe itself is mathematically describable everywhere, universally throughout the universe, kind of thing, right? The fact that the universe has been proven to be expanding didn't prove that that had to be the case.
No, but that's why we think it's the case. The problem is that the uniformity of the universe is not something that's actually been proving it. So when you say that it's been proven, that's just
Yeah, yeah,
not
I take
accurate.
your point. Yep, that's correct. But let me phrase it this way: everywhere we have observed, this is the case so far, and this includes areas that the theist, back before the 20th century, they would have argued this. And guess what? Once we looked out with our telescopes in the 20th century, it is true everywhere we've looked so far, at least that you can grant at least that, right?
Well, I mean, it's not okay. I'm being a little pedantic here, but the problem is you keep bringing it up. So, the uniformity of the universe is a brute fact that we assume in science. It's not something that's been proven. The reason we assume it is because stars exist all the way back as far as we can tell throughout the history of the universe, and stars actually exist under certain mathematical formulas. I don't want to say that because that confuses things, but they exist in a standard chemical way that we understand. So that's sort of why we assume that everything. But there's also like a lot of matter out there that we don't see, we don't understand, and we're just assuming is matter as dark matter or dark energy. So it very well could be that those spaces where those um, things preside could be completely different than our current understanding of of how reality works. So I just want to put that out there, because when you say that we've proven, or we haven't actually proven any of that. It's just an assumption based off of what we're seeing, and it's also recognized that we can't actually see something like, I want to say, like 70% of the matter that's out there. So
Mhm. Okay, and I take your point there, and I believe it or not, I agree with you. But look, on the atheist side, you have to have a brute fact, right? It's a brute fact. It's an assumption, to use Darren's words. I think that we have an explanation with the theist thing. I get Darren doesn't qualify it as an explanation, but I think it does. If in terms of a hypothetical statement and stuff, it makes sense. Yeah, if God exists, the antecedent conditions that can explain why we see these features. Whereas on the atheist side, you have no choice as of yet. You just got to take it as a brute fact, as an unproven assumption, and
right, but
that's
but you're taking your God as a brute fact. So I don't know why we need it, why a God is even needed if we've both got brute facts. We can just assume that reality exists, and it exists in an orderly fashion. And that's why we have logic, because
well.
reality is logical.
Okay, so I will respond to this then. So that's not true, the comparison you made, right? Because there's a difference here, right? So the principle of sufficient reason states that there has to be a sufficient explanation for why anything exists, or the way it is, and that can be explained either through a external cause of some sort, or an external explanation for the principle of sufficient reason, or in its own internal necessity. Now, with the case of God, we're saying he's explained by his own internal necessity. That's what the hypothesis posits.
Right,
But
but you
with
can say
you,
the same thing about
you're not
reality.
okay. So you're saying you would argue that the universe is just necessary, and it's necessarily logical and mathematically describable everywhere within the universe.
Well, our universe, our observable universe, sure.
Okay, okay. So that I won't get into it just because it's a debate on God's existence, but that's where I would come back with a cosmological argument and try to prove that. But actually, we can prove the universe is not logically necessary. It's not necessary, and we can actually prove that. But
Well, except that argument fails. So it doesn't matter that you can come back with it. The argument fails, and you don't prove things through arguments.
I mean, the evidence proves that it can't exist too. But okay,
No, the
again, it's
evidence
up to
doesn't
you.
prove that the universe can't exist necessarily.
I think it does.
Well, yeah,
It's
it's
up
your
to you. Do you want
opinion
to
that it
debate
does,
it,
but
or do
that
you want to?
doesn't.
Do you want to? I'll leave it up to you as the guy. Would you like to should we discuss some ways of that, or should we move
Go for
on?
it. It's your show.
Okay, it's totally up to you, kind of thing. Because I'm trying to stay focused on this without going into a God does God exist debate. But
Well, I mean, I think at this point, because I think we have some very fundamental impasses. I don't view what you consider an explanation an actual explanation, because I don't see that it actually explains anything. I don't see how saying, if this thing I've created to explain this exists, then it explains it.
fair enough.
I just don't see it. So,
Okay. So I'll try to give some reasons, kind of thing. But just before I do, one last question on the mathematical numbers for you, and it's something that you said before I forget it, that mathematical numbers are invented, right? It's something human beings have come up with based on just how we see reality and stuff.
um,
I've shown a video. It seems that mathematics is actually inherent, even in little babies. They can appreciate mathematical concepts and stuff like that. So I wanted to get from you, like, why is that the case? It does seem that mathematics is just it's inherent to human beings, even little babies who can't even speak or think rationally in any way. They do recognize concepts of numbers, and I can show a video
yeah,
if you need to, but yeah, you probably know what
yeah.
I'm
No,
talking.
this I find a totally fascinating idea here, because if because the way we okay, and I'll uh, uh, just preamble this with saying that, this is how I see things, obviously. So as far as I can tell, the um, mathematic is just a language that we use to describe reality. It's a more precise language than, say, English or French or anything else, but it's just a set of vowels and consonants that we just uh, put together to describe what we're actually seeing. And a lot of math is concepts that we've extracted from a large um, number of things that we've seen. So, two apples, two bricks. We abstract that concept out and call it a two things, 2x. Um, and so, and at one point, zero wasn't even part of our mathematical language. It wasn't until much later that zero became part of our mathematical language. Um, and you can actually watch math evolve, the language evolve um, over the centuries if you have an interest in looking that up. But anyways, as far as your babies go, it's fairly fascinating the way our brains learn because our brains are basically put into this you know people make jokes about brains in a vat, but in a very real sense we are really brains in a vat, and our vat is just called the skull. And so it's taking in all this information at for the first time after they're born, and it's trying to figure the brain's trying to figure out exactly how the world works. So it does like millions of experiments every second, and obviously they're not like lab experiments or you know even conscious experiments, but it's trying to figure out how it works, how things work. So it figures out the babies figure out how to use their limbs, and they do that through trial and error, and then they learn how to walk and everything. And but our brains are actually pretty good at abstracting out concepts from data. So you get if you see two things, then I mean that's two physical things that you can abstract that out of, and that's how we learn. And because reality exists as it exists, we learn and get this intuition that 2 plus 2 equals 4. If we lived in a universe where 2 plus 2 equaled 10 because of energy conservation was exponential rather than linear for whatever reason, then that's what our intuitions would be. But because we live in a universe that's linear energy conservation, 2 plus 2 equals 4, and we learn that as children because that's what we're constantly being um, inundated with through reality.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. So, um, I want to move on to number three then, because this one's an interesting one, right? The fact that that external world actually exists. This is again just a brute fact or an assumption from the standpoint of science, and it's really something that philosophers need to debate or get into and that sort of thing. So, um, yeah, but the fact that there is an external world and that we're justified in believing that, I think does make more sense on theism, whereby
Yeah,
our
see, I
faith.
don't buy that because
Okay, but why?
there's nothing under theism that inherently means that there's an external world. In fact, I think there's some I don't know if they're Christian, but there's some theological ideas that were just that there is no external world. We just exist in the mind of a god.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think I don't like the way I've worded this is wrong, but I think what I'm trying to say is like how are on atheism, how are you justified in believing that there is an external world and we're not just in the matrix or something like that? Because
Well,
there's nothing. Yeah,
again, what do you mean by atheism? Because atheism is just one conclusion to one question, whether there's a god or not. So
yeah.
it's
So
sort of like asking, what are the how do you get a rocket in under the worldview of evolution? Well, you don't, because evolution doesn't deal with rockets to the moon.
yeah, so my question makes sense, right? Because on atheism, you're assuming theism is false, right? How would we be justified in knowing that there is an external world rather than just assuming it as a brute fact that science has to do?
Well, I don't think there is a. a I think the justification is that that's what we experience. So whether that external world is the matrix or the mind of God or whatever, we live in a world, or if we're just a brain in a vat, then whatever's being plugged in into us is the external world. Or if we whatever, uh, if solipsism is accurate and we're the only minds that actually exist, and but I mean, we're still experiencing an external world. So I mean, it still has laws. We can still make predictions. It's not like I know what the color of your socks are, but um,
Hmm.
I can find out in one way or another if I absolutely had to.
Okay. Okay. So that is a consistent answer, and I think on atheism, defined as just like no theism kind of thing, that is the answer you have to give logically. You have to be just agnostic on the question: Are we in a matrix? Are we in some virtual world, or is this?
Right, but you've got the same problem if you believe in a God, because
Hang on. I have a question. I was leading to a question before we get to my thing. Um, Now, obviously, you are a minority in that, right? Most scientists, they do believe, and they believe they're justified and rational in believing that there is an external world. They take a
well,
realist
yeah, but
position.
that's because they think the question is stupid. So, which I kind of agree with them. This whole external
And
world question, it's
why is
maybe
it?
an interesting question for philosophers to sort of bounce around for the last 5,000 years, but um, scientists are more interested in figuring out the what reality is.
Right. Okay. So you would say, yeah, the scientists, you recognize this as a question beyond the scope of science. You need philosophy. That's the normative higher order discipline to deal
Well,
with this
no, I
question.
disagree with that completely because philosophers don't have a way to distinguish fact from fiction. I mean, they can come up with a bunch of ideas, but it's not like they can demonstrate that any of their ideas are actually true.
Okay. Okay. Well, I totally disagree with that. But okay. So so atheism just has to take this as an assumption or be logically consistent. I would say advocate for being Darren Lute here. He's right. Just be agnostic because there is no way from within the system through derivative knowledge, through observations or anything like that to adjudicate this. But there is a way in philosophy to get the answer to this.
No,
And
there's
it
not.
makes sense only on theism, right? So this is why I prefer theism here through properly basic beliefs. That's how I know. I'm not just justified. I
Yeah, but
know
properly
there's an
basic beliefs are not a real thing.
what do you mean they're not a problem? You don't believe that some of your beliefs are derived from other beliefs? You just said Albert Einstein derived his belief in the
Well,
possibility
yeah,
of
but
relativity theory from math. So
right,
there
but
is a higher. Oh, sorry.
properly basic beliefs are more than just derived ideas.
No, the properly basic beliefs in the first place, basic beliefs. Do you believe there are basic beliefs, right? There are foundational beliefs upon which we derive either directly or indirectly all of our other beliefs. There is foundational.
Well, we live in brute facts, so yes, there are brute facts that we have to acknowledge.
Great. So you deny the only thing you deny is that these basic beliefs can be proper with respect to knowledge or something like that, some criteria for knowledge and that sort of
Well,
thing.
I mean, they might be able to, but from all the study I've done on the proper basic beliefs that you hold to, I don't think that your methodology gets you anywhere near there.
Okay, so we can combine this with number five because I'm saying on atheism, it's just impossible. We could never have any knowledge. We could never have a warranted true belief or whatever because I know you disagree with my definition of knowledge. Fine, however you define knowledge, it's impossible on atheism, but it makes
No, it's
much more
not.
sense on theism.
No,
Um,
it's not. And if any the problem is that any argument you give against the atheist having knowledge, you have to give for your um, theist position as well. There's no way that positing a God doesn't get you out of any of these problems that you're ascribing to atheism.
Okay, so let's do these if then things. You do it on the atheism side. I'm going to do it on the theist side first, right? So okay, so if God exists, I granted I know you don't believe that God exists, but if the God exists that I'm defining him, then he would have been the one who would have designed the universe and designed us, our cognitive and sensory faculties, in such a way that they would be knowledge conducive or truth conducive. That makes sense as a perfect explanation. Yep, if that's true, yeah, we could gain knowledge in that, and our faculties would be designed in such a way as to obtain knowledge. Now, you do that on the other side. If atheism is true, atheism has no theism. How do
Well,
we know?
we know that God didn't design our faculties, and we know that our knowledge obtainers are not always reliable. So we already know that five is false on the theism side, just on the face of it. And
Okay,
so,
great.
if
How do you know
atheism
that?
is,
Sorry. How do you know that you ever have? You just said that we know it's not always reliable. Cool. How do you know they're ever reliable on atheism?
well, under theism, we know exactly the same thing as we know under atheism. The problem is you're trying to make atheism out as this lacking in it in in truth gathering ability. But the problem is that the same exact things the same for under theism, because I mean, sure, God can tell you that He gave you truth gathering and knowledge obtainers. That doesn't mean He actually did, and you still haven't demonstrated that God's even a real possibility to begin with. So, under atheism, the reason we are able to have truth gatherers and obtain knowledge is because we can actually demonstrate that we have it by making novel testable predictions. We take what we already know, we make an assumption or we make a prediction of what something we don't know, and we go out and find it. And that's how we gain knowledge. And we have truth gatherers because over when we've evolved, if we didn't have truth gatherers, then we wouldn't be able to feed ourselves or live. And the people that aren't able to live aren't able to um, survive long enough to reproduce.
Okay. Okay. And I know that you keep coming back to like, oh, well, you haven't proven God is possible. And I haven't forgotten that, right? So I'm just trying to go over this argument. But after we're done, as long as you've got the time,
Ah, I've got all day.
I will make an attempt to prove that God is possible. The God hypothesis is possible. And I haven't forgotten about my promise to deal with the necessity of the universe. So we'll come to that at the end. But I just want to finish off these things. Now, I admit, number six, I'm drawing a blank as to what I had in mind here in terms of the adequacy of language. Oh, okay. Well, again, it's kind of a design. We've kind of covered this, but it's just, again, like, why is it designed? You're going to say, well, the language evolved or emerged in relation to describing reality and stuff like that. So I'm not sure what I had in mind there, why that favors theism. Must have had some reason, but I forget.
Well,
Now,
if you remember, we can always go back to it.
okay, so number seven, this is a big thing, right? And it's not just about moral values, but the existence of normative values at all. There are three types. There are aesthetic values, moral values, but also epistemic values, right? There are oughts, what we epistemically ought, right? You scolded me as a theist for being stupid in one way or another, not being rational. You would argue I ought to give up my belief in Christianity. So yeah, how did these normative values come up with? Where do they come from, especially in relation to science or doing proper science and methodology, scientific methodology there? Again, on theism, the design hypothesis perfectly can account for where these values come from. They're grounded in God's values, and science is derivative as a methodology on that basis. I don't see where values can come from at all on atheism.
Well, it's because scientists are always trying to prove each other wrong, and they double check your work. That's sort of what makes science able to actually come to knowledge and come to an understanding of how reality works is because every time a paper comes out, you've got 5 or 6 teams around the world that are going to check your work. They're going to do the experiments you did. They're going to try to reproduce your findings, because in science, it's not. It's sort of a different atmosphere than you get in pretty much any other um, field. I mean, I noticed that a lot of like theists will go ahead and back each other, even if they know that the other person's wrong, and they may have their internal squabbles. But in science, the whole thing is internal squabbles. The whole point of it's how you become famous in science is by proving other people wrong. So if you put out a paper that has bad information on it, then you're going to get called out on it. And and unless you unless you want to be labeled as a quack or a scam artist in the community, then you do the best work you can. It's why scientists are so careful with a lot of their words when they're talking internally. Although, granted, they tend to get a lot sloppier with their words when they're talking to other non-scientists.
I'm not, okay, so I'm not sure that works, right? Because the what you're talking about, right? Like, oh, the shame of being exposed as a fraud and stuff like that. Like these presuppose that there are those normative values. Like the reason we shame someone at all is because it's based on this. Well, you ought not to falsely report data, but
Well,
you
no,
ought.
not really. Shame is just a pain in the is just a form of mental pain uh, in that you experience when because of the way your brain's wired. So it's not that it's this normative odd or anything. It's just the very fact that when you experience pain, in this case, the pain of shame, then the very structure of your brain uh, flinches away from that.
Well, I see. I don't think you're understanding. My point is deeper though. Like what? Look, that the mental pain of shame under atheism, we should never experience that. Why on earth? It, and I'm
What do you
saying
mean? What do you
never.
mean we shouldn't experience that
Why,
under?
if I cheat, why shouldn't I be proud? Like, dang, I'm so smart, and people should be praising me. Like, wow, you figured out this genius way to cheat. You're so smart. Like, what? Why should we feel shame
Well,
at all?
well, because
It's
it's how our
because
brains are wired. It isn't about what we ought to do. I mean, that's sort of like saying how heavy is the color red? Is completely complete red herring. It's not about these external oughts or anything. It's how we are built. It's how we think. It's what the mirror neurons in our brain are that make up our us are doing. It's sort of like the whole digestion is what your stomach does. Shame is what your brain does. And so if you have any sort of um, desire to be respected, then shame is just going to be a byproduct of how your brain works. It's not about external odds. It's about how reality works.
okay. I have a response. It's gonna get into another debate. So like I'll just ask you is it okay if we get into a
Sure.
little bit of substance? Okay. So I think that what you just said, you are agreeing with me that it is based on normative values, but you're saying that the normative values that I think you would agree that that's kind of it's a unique sensation. We do the reason why we feel mental anguish is because our brains are set up to at least produce this sensation of a normative. You ought not to do that. At the very least, you can agree that there is a unique or differentiating sensation of ought. Then,
Mm, I think odds, for just to clarify my position, I think odds are more a result of what our goals are than anything else. They're not this external thing that exists in the world. They're just uh, an extension of what our goals are.
yeah, okay. I mean, I guess I would just say, like, so it could be. true. Obviously, from a Christian perspective, I would say like if that's true in describing you, we would have to attribute that to sin. Like somehow your faculties are messed up where you're not getting this. But I would say it's not true. That's not true with respect to most human beings. I think there is this distinctive normative ought that goes beyond just okay. Is it a means and reasoning? And look, when we engage in means and reasoning in other areas, um, we don't feel the same ought sensation or value ought sensation and stuff. There is a difference that at least I feel, and I know many others have testified they feel. So I don't know if you
Right,
feel
but
that distinction, but there
right, but
is.
that feeling comes from how our brains are wired. It's not this external thing that exists. It's all inside how the brain experiences, and we don't. It's not like it's necessarily a goal that's we can articulate. Sometimes we just want to have the goal of being of having integrity. It's not something we articulate. It's just something we feel we need to do, and
Okay.
we feel we need to do that because of the way our brains
Okay. So I'm
are
let's
wired.
assume you're correct about the brain, because I'm coming to that next. But just to clarify, so you are acknowledging that there is this distinctive, unique. There are these normative odds as a sensation. You think it's produced just a production of the brain. That's fine for now, but you do recognize there are that foundational normative odds as a sensation that people have. Um,
Um, well, depends on what you mean, but I pretty sure I don't. Not the way you mean, anyways.
okay. Um, okay. Okay. Fine. So I'll move on. So let's. Then there's that issue. Okay, how do we explain these sensations and stuff that we base shame or pride and stuff like that on in terms with respect to our epistemic, moral, or aesthetic oughts and values and stuff. Now you say it's just the brain. Obviously, I'm going to say no. That's a reductionist standpoint. So just one question, because I know that's not the topic of today's debate proper, but this is something you and I have debated on my substance dualism show before, where you tend to identify, right? So you say that the brain states in the brain and the normative ought are the sensation of it at least are identical. They are the same thing. I would argue they're not identical. The sensation itself is something, it's different than the brain state, which causes us to have that. So I can, there's a causal relation, but you're claiming there's an identity relation. At times you've admitted that no, there is this causal relation. The brain state is what causes me to feel this. But if
Well,
you see,
that's a difference in language, but I see them as the same thing.
okay, so my point here is, would you recognize then that it you can't no longer say that the brain state is causing us. Causal relations and identity relations are
Well,
mutually exclusive.
well,
It's
colloquially, I would say it causes it just because they cause doesn't necessarily mean colloquially what it means in philosophy. If we're talking strictly philosophical language, then I would say the identity is what I'm saying.
okay. Okay, so again, this isn't the topic of debate, so I'll give kind of like my thought, and then I'll give you the last word, and then we can move on, kind of thing. But yeah, so I would just say that it's abundantly apparent to everyone that the sensations that we have are not identical to the brain states themselves. They're two different things, and they clearly stand in causal relations. And many neuroscientists have published papers trying to prove this scientifically and stuff like that. So there is a clear distinction. And look, you might say, well, it's the brain states that cause us to have this, or if you're a substance dualist, vice versa, whatever. We don't need to get into that. We can assume physicalism, but once you say that a brain state is causing you to have the sensation, that means they're not identical. And it's the same with any other sensation. When I see the color red and I see that have the sensation of redness, that can't be identical to a neuron firing in my brain. It may be caused by that, but they're not identical. And with that, Darren, you can get the last word on this, and then we can move on.
Well, I would just say that trying to apply philosophical language to the science isn't going to help you because the scientists aren't trained in philosophical language. So when they say cause, they actually mean identical in the neurosciences. Just because they're using the word colloquially, they're not using it in any sort of philosophically rigor. Um, and we can actually prove that it's all identical because if you change, it's I like to call it the whiskey experiment, but you can use whatever brand of liquor you like. And if you when you get drunk, personalities, I mean, maybe not yours specifically, but I'm sure everyone that listening has friends or relations where their personality changes when they get drunk. And that's partly, and we know why that happens because the chemicals that are in the alcohol go into the brain and change the chemical makeup of the brain. And when you change the chemical makeup of the brain, it changes how it thinks. It's why we have antidepressants and why they work. We also know that the brain uh, doesn't break the I think it's the second law of thermodynamics. There's no extra energy being introduced into the brain, so we know there's nothing strange going on there, like a dual substance. We know that if you add uh, magnetic fields to the brain, it changes how you think. We know that if you remove or damage part of the brain, it changes how you think. We have lots of examples of where a tumor in the brain changes how you think. Um, and between that and no breakage of the second law of thermodynamics, which would indicate some sort of soul or some other substance that's affecting the material of the brain, I think that having it physicalism those, is the most plausible way to go.
Okay, cool. So I promised you the last word on that. So, all right, cool. So at this point, let me just see if we have, I think we have one questions. Awesome. So, yep, just a dude subscribed. Awesome. Welcome to Real Seekers. And Darren, we have our good buddy Brian with an I, and he's saying shame. Isn't that learned? What someone feels shame for in one culture, people in other cultures wouldn't feel shame for.
Yep, it's a generally learned thing. Yeah, I think part of it is probably ingrained as well because the things that people, even across cultures, even if the specifics aren't exactly the same, it's the general shape of things that tend to be consistent across cultures.
Yeah, yeah, I kind of agree with your answer there. Yeah, it's in part, you can learn to be ashamed of certain things, but shame itself is inherent to us as humans, and there are certain things, even little kids without being taught that they'll know to be ashamed or something like that. So it's both is my answer. Okay, so as promised, this is kind of getting into a different debate, but Darren's whole point here is okay, look, your hypothesis hasn't even been proven to be possible, so I can't even consider it as an explanation. I want to be clear that in order to make an abductive argument in this way, I it's not required to first prove that a hypothesis is possible. You just outline the hypothesis and then you can test it. So here's just one example kind of thing, right? So for example, the concept of a square circle we know for a fact is impossible. That's not even possible. But I could set up a thing where, okay, we have a square circle defined in the usual way, plus if a square circle exists, it entails that a pink flamingo will flap around Darren's head right now at this very moment. Great. So here's my hypothesis: a square circle defined in the Dalian way exists. Okay, here's a conditional. If that's true, then the pink flamingo. Darren, is there a pink flamingo flapping around your head right now?
No, but there's no direct linkage between a square circle and a pink flamingo. So that's
There
not
is as
really
I
it's
defined it
not
as
a
such.
hypothesis that would even be
No, but
possible to
I
begin with.
defined it as such, right? I get to
Well, it
define
doesn't matter, and this is why science had to um, break away from philosophy, because it doesn't matter if you've defined it that way. The problem is that there has to be, and when you're trying to distinguish fact from fiction, there has to be more than just defining things and then defining things so that they match what you see around you. You have
no,
to do more if you're going to distinguish fact from fiction,
no,
and
but
I
you
think
don't, right?
that's
Because
the main reason why philosophy you don't go to philosophy to get a rocket to the moon.
okay, that's just complete rubbish, right? Right now, we've just tested the Dalian square circle, and through your
No,
observations, we
no, we
falsified.
haven't.
Yeah,
That's the problem. We
we have.
haven't. No, we haven't, because
Are you? Okay,
you
go ahead.
haven't done the work to actually do the testing, and
I
this
did.
is
I
why
asked
philosophers
you.
don't. That's why scientists don't care what philosophers think most of the time. Just because if you can say this is a test, then you don't actually understand what testing means.
No, I do. It's actually you that doesn't, right? Because unless yes, I'm relying on your testimony as being truthful in this case, right? And I think the principle of testimony uh, would warrant my belief in your testimony that you were not seeing a pink flamingo. But the Dalian square circle, as defined that way, that is a concept that could be tested in that way, and it was, and it failed. So therefore, it's falsified. That's exactly how that works.
Well,
Um,
that may be
but
how philosophers think it works, but that's not how
that's
it
how
works in the
logic.
scientific
That's how logic
community.
works. If science adopts logic, then it has to agree with that.
Well, science gets us to the moon with rockets, philosophy doesn't. So I'll leave it up to the
No, it's philosophy.
listeners to figure out which of us is more accurate in that their assessment of what testing actually is.
Without philosophy, there was no rockets. There's no science to begin with.
Well, that is something that philosophers say. Yes.
And I've proven with my
No,
case.
no, you
Okay,
haven't.
so let me get to God then, and because that's something you asked me to do to try to prove the possibility of God. And I can see people weren't liking my flamingos; they're dropping like flies in the audience. But okay, so in terms of God being possible, great. So here's the definition of God: He's a real, maximally great being. Um, real, maximally great being. What is that? It is a being that has the maximal possible degree of knowledge, power, and benevolence. All of these things, in terms of my 7 facts that I listed, these 3 properties alone are enough to describe all of those. Further, and it exists necessarily. Those are the 4 properties that this being has. That's all I need for the concept of God that we're talking about here today. He may be other things, so it's a minimal definition, but minimally, he's this. Now, in this case, the possibility of this it's inherently proven. It is irrational and illogical to deny it because it's self-evident by definition. He's defined to have these properties in whatever degree is logically possible to have. It's undeniable. It's self-evident. That proves the possibility.
No, then that doesn't. See, this is why, again, this is why you don't go to philosophy to figure out reality. Because, I mean, in philosophy, it's possible that I can flap my wings and fly to the moon. The problem is that that kind of possibility is not the kind of possibility that science deals
Oh,
with, because that's not the kind of possibility that's even relevant to any sort of discussion about reality.
okay. Okay. So when you speak of possibility, you're insisting upon one has to prove it's factually possible in this world, I guess, right?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about, if your reference is the reality that we exist in, then it has to be, yeah.
Okay. Well, again, through an ontological argument, someone can just prove the logical or metaphysical possibility, and that can create an argument for factual possibility and actual existence in this world. I'm not going down the ontological argument route, but let's stick with okay, your strict demand for factual possibility. Yeah, the real maximally great being, as I define him, is in fact factually possible.
Okay, and how do you demonstrate that's true?
Cool,
Because you can't use
Darren.
an argument to demonstrate it's true because anyone can.
I'll use an observation. Darren Lute, do you exist?
I do exist.
Do you have knowledge?
Yes, I have knowledge.
Do you have benevolence?
Sometimes on my better days.
No, you have some degree of benevolence. Great. Do you have powers?
Define powers.
Do you have the power to lift your arm? Do you have the power to lift up a penny?
Yes, the chemical composition in my body allows me to lift my arms. Yes.
Great. So you have a compossible degree of power, knowledge, and benevolence.
Hmm.
So therefore, in the real world, it is factually possible for a being to have a maximal degree of those things. Now, for
Right.
that,
A physical being is possible to have those things. Yes, you are correct.
okay, can you prove that it's impossible for a spirit? Again, spiritual wasn't part of my
Well,
definition, but
well, shifting the burden of proof is not what I'm interested in. So, can you prove that uh, the claim that you're making, is accurate?
in terms of it being spiritual, because that wasn't part of my claim originally, but I'll add it if I need to.
Well, I mean, that's what you're talking about, right? Is a spiritual being in reality that has all these uh, um, properties to their logical maximum.
Sure, I'll add it. Okay, so I'll use Richard Swinburne, right? So, okay, great. So you exist as a physical being, and you have these properties and
Right,
stuff
and
like
it's the physical being part that allows me to have these properties.
that. Okay, so that's a claim. I would ask you to prove it, but on my claim, I can prove that it's possible to be a non-physical being and still possess these properties because we can. I wish I had Richard Swinburne's thing in front of me. He has a great way of great thought experiment to prove this. But okay, so what does it mean to be physical, Darren?
Well, in my case, it means that I have chemicals that make me up. Those chemicals form atoms that form cells that form physical systems that allow energy to be moved throughout my body in the form of oxygen and various other things.
Okay. So that's okay. And you experience a bunch of sensations. You have thoughts. You have knowledge of certain propositions and stuff like this. So let's just imagine yourself maintaining these sensations and stuff like that. But let's say now we take away one of your senses. You can no longer hear.
Okay, so
That,
there's some physical thing taken away so that the sound waves that are coming from outside no longer reach my brain. Okay.
yep. But so you would say that such a real maximum great being still possible, factually possible, right? Just because
Uh,
he's lost one of his senses, that's fine, right?
no, I wouldn't say well, it depends on what you mean by maximally great being. Because if I'm the max, then I guess I would be the maximally great being. If I lose my hearing, then I suppose under that definition, but is that the same definition you're using?
For right now, it is, yeah.
Okay, so I'm the maximal being in this thing, and
Yeah.
I
And
lose
I
my
was going to
hearing because
take
some
it.
physical part of me is removed and sound waves are no longer getting to my brain. Okay.
Yes. Okay, cool. Okay. Now let's take away your sense of sight.
Okay.
And
So
I'll
my eyes are damaged and there's no longer light waves bouncing off other physical things in the world around me and reaching my brain.
gotcha. And then you lose all your other senses, but you're still having these same sensations. It's still possible you're having these same um, thoughts and knowledge. You're still a sentient being with knowledge and thoughts and possessing these properties. Let's put it that way.
Well, I'm still the same because I had these senses to begin with, this physical senses to begin with, and I uh, had that knowledge while I had those senses. But without those senses, I don't know that I would be able to gather new knowledge just because I'm not actually experiencing the reality at that point.
Okay. And okay, but you would still be a being with hypothetically the maximum amount of knowledge, powers, and benevolence, despite you lacking all of those physical senses and stuff like that.
I don't think that's the case, but okay.
You know, I think that's the case. Well, okay.
Because my brother, if he still had those senses, he could be more benevolent than I can because I can no longer move
Right.
around the earth and actually be benevolent. He can have more knowledge than I can because he can continue to learn.
Okay. Okay. So forget the maximal part just for now, though. But you can still have knowledge, power, and benevolence despite
Well, I
losing.
don't think I can have any power at that point because if I lose all my senses, then I don't know that I can actually be able to like lift my arm anymore.
Of course, you could. You don't have to sense that you could do it to be able to do that.
Well, if I lose all my senses, then I have no way to sense that my arm's being moved around, right?
You wouldn't know that you're lifting your arm, but you could still do it.
Right,
Like
but I wouldn't have the power to like lift up a cup because I wouldn't be able to see it or anything else. So that's a decrease in my power.
sure, but you still have a degree of power, right? So it's showing these properties are. I'm trying to prove that these properties are consistent with being a non-physical being slowly but surely, right? So
Well, except you're going to run into a problem because my brain is physical. So if you take away my brain, then I no longer have any of those powers.
okay, prove that because I think that you would still have knowledge thing. How can you prove that you
Well,
wouldn't have
again,
that?
shifting the burden of proof is not something I'm interested in at this point. So if you want to claim that I would still have those powers without a brain, then you're just going to have to
But
demonstrate that.
if we're demonstrating just possibility, and in this case factual possibility, you have to prove that something about the facts entails a factual contradiction between, on
Again,
the
I'm
one
not
hand, the
interested.
notion.
I'm not interested in shifting up the
That's not a
burden
shifting
here.
of burden. That's the way it works because there
Well,
put
it
it
may
this
be
way,
the way it works in
there is
philosophy, but
no.
again, you don't
Okay, no,
figure
but
out
here there
reality
is
through
no. Here's my
philosophy.
proof. There's no provable contradiction between having knowledge, power, and thing, and being non-physical. There is no contradiction there, either explicit or implicit.
Well, except all the things that you're saying have power. The only examples we have of things that have power are physical. So if you want to claim that nothing that you can have power without the physical, then you have to show that you can have this cause and effect without being physical,
Why do I have to prove? Why do I have to
because
prove
you're the one
based
that's
on
making the
the
claim.
fact that
That's how
only
burden of proof
no,
works.
but based the fact that we've only ever observed physical things possessing a property of various powers of sorts or capabilities of sorts does not entail that only physical things can have such.
Well, it
It doesn't
entails that the
entail a
physical things are
contradiction.
the only things we are aware of that can
So
have that
what?
power.
So what? How does that prove that there's a contradiction between a being having power,
Well, you
knowledge?
have to do more than not getting a contradiction. That
That's
just having a
possibility.
not flapping my wings and flying to the moon, there's no contradiction in that, but that doesn't mean that it's actually possible in reality. And we're talking about possible in reality.
No, but that is precisely all that's needed to prove possibility, to prove that there's no contradiction. Now, in your case,
No.
you're
See, this is why
specifying
you
a
don't go to
factual. No,
philosophy
but
to
listen,
figure out
listen.
reality.
You're specifying a factual in terms of, that the facts entail there would be a contradiction. I can prove there's a contradiction with you, a factual contradiction with you flapping your arms to the moon, right? That I can appeal to certain proven physical facts that contradict you doing that. There's
Well,
no, I can prove it's
and I can appeal to certain physical facts that because you haven't even told me what it would even mean to be not physical. So it's not like you don't have any contradictions. You're just saying you haven't
no,
even demonstrated that your idea is even coherent. How do
no,
you have
there's
how
no
do you have a
contradiction.
mind without physics, without something physical?
You don't have to explain how, right? Because that's a separate.
Well, you
I'm
kind of
saying that
do.
I can prove there's no contradiction, and you
No,
can't
you
prove
can't.
there is.
You can't
Yes,
you can't
because
prove
there
there's no
is.
contradiction because you don't even know what you mean by not physical.
Yes, I do. I mean that
Okay, then
it doesn't have the properties you ascribed when you defined physical, and yet it still
okay, so what
possesses
properties
knowledge,
does it have?
power. It possesses knowledge, power, and benevolence.
And how does it possess knowledge, power, and benevolence if without physical?
You're asking a different question. It doesn't mean it matter how. It matters that there's no contradiction in it having it. That's all we need
You
to do.
you keep saying that, but
There is no
you haven't
fact.
even demonstrated that what you're saying is even
No, but Darren,
coherent.
I've
How
demonstrated there's no facts that contradict a non-physical being, as you describe physical, and it possessing these three properties. There is
well,
no fact of contradiction.
I think that your audience will recognize that just saying
No,
that
but
there's no
what is the
contradiction when
law?
you can't even demonstrate what non-physical
No, but you can
is a
demonstrate.
problem.
I can demonstrate non-physical because I asked you to define what physical is, and I'm saying, okay, take away that. It's not that. That
Okay,
makes it
that's
non-physical.
like saying the desk is not red. It tells you absolutely nothing what the desk is.
But that doesn't matter. You The
It
goal
kind of
was for
does
me to
because if you're
prove the
saying that
fact. No, it isn't. It
the
doesn't. It doesn't.
non-physical can have these properties, then you kind of need to tell us how it has
No,
these
I don't.
properties.
Because you can't describe what dark energy is. That doesn't matter. The what
Well,
is
I am
irrelevant,
also not making
whether
any
it's
claims about
possible.
dark energy.
No, but it doesn't. But you, others, and scientists would, and you would not demand that they prove. Well, what is? Tell
Well,
me the
actually,
nature
I
of it
would.
in
If
order
they're
to know
making
if the
claims
fact
about
is
what dark
possible.
energy is, then they kind of have to prove it.
No, but it's dark energy is factually possible without them answering the what questions that you're demanding of me. Same deal here. I
Well,
can prove the
dark energy is
factual.
just a word we use as a
I can
placeholder because
prove
we
the
don't know what it
factual.
is.
I can prove the factual possibility
You haven't
because
so
there's
far.
no fact that contradicts those three properties
Well,
and a being that doesn't have the properties of a physical definition that you no
okay,
contradiction results at
okay,
all.
you keep claiming that you've proven that, but you haven't.
I
All you've
have.
done is say
That's the
that you
fact.
can take away all the physical stuff and still have the stuff. That's not proving it. That's
It
just
is.
asserting it.
That's all you have to do for the possibility. That's
No,
literally all you have to
no,
do is
no, 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 no,
evaluate
no,
the
no.
concept and see. Okay, then. Okay, so it should be easy. What is the fact of our world that contradicts this?
The fact of our
Proven fact.
okay, the fact is
You
that
said it.
physical is the only thing that we know that actually exists, and all the properties that you're describing have physical reasons for actually existing. So if you're taking away the physical reason that they exist, you have to explain how that happens.
No, you don't have to explain how it happens. But okay, so here's the fact. And I disagree with your fact, but I'm going to grant it from your perspective. The facts as you know it are that there's only been physical beings or something that possess these properties.
Well,
So what that
and
that
in addition to that,
that
the
fact
properties
is
only
not
exist because of the physical things that allow them to exist.
okay. Okay, cool. So that's a fact I'm going to dispute. Where how did that become proven a fact?
Okay, if you can just make up a fact that these things can exist without physical things, then you can't complain that I'm saying that is fact. You're tossing around the word fact as if it's an actual fact when it isn't. It's an idea that you haven't been able to prove is actually real. So claiming that it's a fact is not something that you can do. You cannot claim that it's a fact that you can have these properties without having the physical. All you can say is that you use the words to say, I'm removing the physical from these properties, and I'm also saying that that can exist. That's not a fact. That's just you using words to say what you want to say.
No, it's the way we would prove something is possible is by showing and saying that there is
Which you
no
haven't done.
relevant contradiction that results. And in this case, it's on a factual level because that's where you
No,
push.
it's not on a factual level.
Yeah, it
That's the
is.
problem. It is not on a
And
factual level.
okay, and I've asked you what. Okay, provide what is the fact that contradicts a non-physical being that has those three properties? And you said it's the fact that we've observed. No one has observed such a being or something. All the beings that have those three properties are physical. And
The fact is that
it's,
I can't even get you to tell me what the non-physical is. All you say is that it's not physical. That doesn't tell me what it is. Just like saying that the desk isn't red doesn't tell me what the desk is. You
well,
keep claiming that this is that non-physical is possible, but you haven't told me what it is to
But
even
that
be able to
okay?
test your claim that it is possible.
Do you agree it's not necessary for me to prove what something is
No, I
for
do
to
not
prove that
agree. You
don't
can't
you?
just you
Great. So
can't just say a
dark energy is
word and then
bullshit.
claim that
Dark
it does
energy is
all these
bullshit.
things without telling
Dark
what it
matter's
is.
BS. I've never seen a subatomic particle. That's BS. I'm going to throw out everything. I don't care about your measurements. I don't believe it. I'm just going to be skeptical
Do
of
you
your
have
claims.
measurements for this non-physical? That would be something.
Of course we do. Um, anyways, did you hear what I said? Right, like you're doing your standard of me proving what something is not necessary for proving the possibility of something. All
Well,
that's
and
required
this
for
is
that
why you
is
don't go to
for
philosophy to try to prove what about things about reality. This is why philosophy cannot be the grounding of scientific method, because you are making this claim that you don't need to tell me what the non-physical is, and I can't even tell if you have a coherent idea or not. So we can't even get to the facts of the matter because I don't even know if your idea is even coherent because you refuse to tell me what the non-physical is.
it's okay. It's a substance. It's a property bearing thing. That's
Okay, what
that's
does
what
that
it is.
mean?
What do you mean? What does that mean? It's a thing that bears properties. In this case, the three
Right.
properties.
What does that mean? I mean, what is this substance that bears these properties?
I don't understand what you're asking. That's the most basic element. Things come in mereology. Things come in three different forms. There are substances, there are property things, and there are heaps. And a substance is the most unified and most basic element. It
Right, but
is
if I say the Empire State Building is a substance, that tells you absolutely nothing about it or what it can do or what it can possess or anything. So I need more than just it's a
what do you
substance.
mean? That
I need
doesn't
what is
substances
it?
are substances by definition are just what they are. When you say the property, first of all, the Empire State Building is a property thing. It's not a substance. But yeah, that's just a technical note. But yeah, when you tell me it's a property thing or a substance, yeah, that tells me a lot. That means it's a thing that exists that is bearing up certain properties.
Okay, well
Then I can go on to describe.
you can't just assert
Then
it's a thing that exists
then I
if you
can go
haven't
and
demonstrated
describe.
that it actually exists. Isn't that like, I mean, you're the philosopher, isn't that like begging the question if you claim that it's something that exists without before you even get to the point where you demonstrate that it exists?
No, because you're asking me for a definition of what something is, which in itself is irrelevant. But you've stated that you don't acknowledge that, so I have to go into the question of what, and this is the answer to what it is. I don't have to prove what I'm saying, but are
Well,
you
if you're
denying
making the
that
claim, you kind of do.
are you denying that substances exist, that they're not possible, for
Well,
example?
the only substances that I'm aware of are physical substances. So if you're claiming that you're taking away the physical, as far as I can tell, you're taking away the substance. So
Okay, what's a physical
if you want to claim
substance?
that there's a non-physical substance, I need more than just it's a thing.
What is a physical substance then? Let me see how you answer, and I'll see if I can glean notes. What is a physical substance?
Well, we can measure it. Can you measure this non-physical stuff?
So
I
you're
mean, is
ascribing
there
certain properties it has to define it. That's not a proper definition of something. You can't define
Well,
something and say,
I'm not doing the definition at this point. I'm just asking, I'm trying to clarify here. This
okay,
non-physical substance, can you measure it? Because we can measure physical things. Can you measure, because that at least, if it's got properties, you're saying it's got properties, and we can measure the properties, that at least tells us that the thing exists, right?
in its spiritual form, you cannot empirically measure it. No,
Okay, so we can't measure it. Okay, so if you can't measure it, how do you know that it's a thing that exists, uh, that has properties?
I'm still waiting for the definition of what a physical substance is. So it's
Well,
something that you can
I'm
measure.
I'm trying to get to this claim that you can have non-physical substances that have properties, and you're saying we can't measure the properties, so we can't tell that it exists that way. So how do we tell that this non-physical substance exists if we can't measure the properties?
Again,
Because
I
even
waiting
even
for
if
my
even
question.
if even if you can't tell me exactly what the substance is, if we can measure the properties, then at least we know it exists. Even if we can't, even if you can't tell me exactly what this substance is. So
Okay,
how do we measure these properties so that we
we have
know that
no
this
ways of
substance
knowing that
exists?
the ways of knowing, that's a totally different question, right? So you were originally asking me what, right? Not how do I know it exists, right? Because the point is I'm trying to prove the possibility of this concept,
Right.
right?
And
And
if you
that means
can't even measure it, if you
possibility doesn't mean it does exist. So it's, again, what is a physical substance? Let's go down, right? Because you're demanding this answer from me on what a
okay,
spiritual substance is. What's a physical substance?
physical substance is a wave of energy, basically.
Wave of energy. Okay.
Yeah.
And what are,
And with different constructions of that wave of energies produces electrons, um, protons, atoms, people, etc.
gotcha. Yeah. Oh, okay. All of those subatomic particles that arise from the quantum on the quantum realm and stuff like that. Okay. So that's, so physical substances just are those subatomic particles, or are physical substances made up of space? Because from my understanding, certain physical things are, they're not just made up of subatomic particles, but it's the relations between the subatomic particles, most of which is just totally empty space. So are we
Right.
saying physical things are just empty nothingness, empty space
That's
plus
part of
form?
what they are. They're also the electrons, etc., that go into them.
Okay, so what is empty space then? That doesn't make sense. That just sounds like a nonsense to me. Like you're talking about spirits and magic now. Like what is empty space?
You don't know what empty space is?
No, what is it? Tell me, as a, what is it made out of? What is it?
Well, if it's empty, then it's not a thing. It's empty. So it's not made
Oh,
of anything. It's empty.
but it can't just, it's not nothing, nothingness, right? Empty space is not nothing,
It is in a colloquial sense.
but not in a technical, actual sense. And I want to know what physical substances actually are. I don't care about colloquialisms.
Right, but this is a red herring. You're being
No,
ridiculous because you're
it's
trying
not.
to, yes, yes, you're
There's a
being
point.
ridiculous. I'm trying, you made the claim that if we take away the physical, we get some sort of non-physical substance. I asked you what that non-physical substance is, and that has this properties. You can't measure the properties. You have, as far as I can tell, you have no way to interact with it. If you have a way to interact with it, that'd be cool.
Oh,
But
we do, but
okay, so
that's
what's this?
neither here
So
nor
what's this
there.
interaction that we can do with it?
Okay, okay. So before I'll answer that, and we'll move on to this red herring. But do you acknowledge on the last point that I at least established my point, where
No,
there
you
is a point
didn't.
where you can't answer this what question, and then it's totally irrelevant. That physical substances are
And
possible, despite the
and
fact
like
that
and
you
like I
answered it.
and like I
You
already
have,
said, even if you don't know exactly what it is, if you can measure it, you at least know it exists. So that's why I
true,
moved on
true.
to how do you measure it? Because then we could at least tell if it exists. So how do we interact with these things that you can prove are actually properties of this non-physical substance?
Right. So this is where you get into arguments for God's existence on the basis of the evidence that we have, and that
Okay,
is
so
established logically. And also, we have built-in God detectors, a God sense that we are all
okay,
equipped with to varying
and
degrees.
how do you demonstrate that any of that's actually true?
Demonstrate, or do you mean how? Because I thought originally
Yeah,
you were saying, how do I
yes,
know?
because you can claim that we are God detectors all you want, but that doesn't just having an assertion, having a claim isn't a proof that your claim is true.
Okay, well, how do you demonstrate to me that you can see the color red as a
Oh,
sensation?
are we doing this? See, this is why you don't go to philosophers to figure out how reality works.
But this is relevant stuff, right? Because
No,
I'm
it
about to
is
tell you that
not
you're,
relevant stuff. This is just a red herring because you can't do anything that you're claiming you can do. So you have to try to force this, you have to try to change the subject onto someone else,
but
which
I'm
is
answering your,
completely a red herring.
Darren.
It's
It's
completely,
not, that's just foolish. I'm
yes.
by
And this is
establishing
an
that you
exact
can't
example of why you
can you
don't go to
demonstrate to me that you
philosophers to
see
figure
the
out
color red?
reality.
Can you demonstrate to me that you see the color red?
I'm Are
I
we
can look
talking
at your
about
brain. I
your
don't see red.
worldview or not? Are we talking about your worldview or not?
We're talking about my worldview, but I'm
Okay,
answering
then it
a short
doesn't
question to
matter
you.
what I can and can't
Okay,
do.
so you can't. So you admit that you can't demonstrate that, and it's meaningless.
Well,
It
I
doesn't.
actually can.
You
That's
don't
not the
know red.
point. The point is that it doesn't matter. Even if I couldn't, it doesn't matter because we're talking about you and your worldview. We're not talking about me and mine.
But that it matters because you're
No,
asking
it
me
doesn't
to
fucking
say how
matter.
I demonstrate. Don't swear on my show. Just you're asking me to demonstrate um, how I know something, and obviously the answer is I can't. In terms of a subjective, properly basic belief, I
Then
can't
there's no
demonstrate.
reason, then you haven't proved anything. You haven't proved that God exists. You haven't proved that he has these, that he's possible. You haven't proved that he's, has, whatever you want to say about him. None of these arguments that you have for God's existence prove that he exists. They're just
Great.
arguments.
When I started
Arguments are
to ask
not
me, ask
evidence. None of them are sound.
wrong, and you didn't ask me to prove it. You asked how do I know, and then you do this little skeptical switcheroo of okay, but how do you demonstrate, how do you know? You keep switching it. You ask me one thing, I answer that one thing, and then you switch it. That little skeptical game's not going to work. Okay, and that's
Th-
why I flip it on you to get you to realize how foolish that is, because you would have to dismiss beliefs that you believe in and you know to be true, like that you
Well,
see
and
colors,
this,
stuff like
see,
that.
this type of mentality is why you don't go to philosophy to figure out reality.
It's exactly why you go to philosophy. It's the
No, you
are
don't.
you,
Philosophy doesn't get rockets to the moon. Philosophy
of course
doesn't
it is.
figure out chemistry or biology or anything. Philosophy is just these ideas that people kick around and argue for thousands of years and never come to a conclusion.
Are you say okay? So they didn't use logic to get the rocket to the moon. That's philosophy.
No, it isn't. It's logic. Logic is, as
Logic's
your
philosophy.
instructor said when he was on S&S, a lot of philosophers don't even study logic. So logic is not equal to philosophy. Logic is just a tool that philosophers use to come up with their ideas.
No,
Same
it's a
as
discipline of
logic
philosophy.
is a tool that scientists use to come up with their ideas. It's not scientists using philosophy, it's scientists using logic.
It's a sub-discipline of philosophy. It is a
It's
branch
also a
of philosophy.
subdiscipline of science.
No,
It
it
doesn't
isn't.
matter. It's a
Wrong.
tool. It's not philosophy.
You'll never study logic in science. In fact, I've never met a
Yes,
scientist
you
who's
do.
studied
Uh,
logic outside of taking a philosophy course. It's a part of, anyways. Okay. Okay. So yeah. Properly basic beliefs can't be demonstrated. You're correct on that. I can't demonstrate that. Arguments for God's existence can. This isn't a show supposed to be talking about the existence of God proper. The original point was to prove the possibility. And the way you do that is by showing there's no contradiction on whatever
no,
level of
that's not how
possibility.
you that's not how you demonstrate the possibility. That may be how
Of course,
philosophers demonstrate possibility, but it is not a valid way to demonstrate philosophy when your context is what exists in reality.
yeah, like I said, you can have the last word because you're just wrong. You don't know how it
Yeah.
works, logically speaking.
Well,
Maybe you've got
science gets
something.
rockets to the moon. Philosophy talks about ideas for thousands of years without coming to a conclusion. So I'll
Really,
let
it's never come to a
your listeners
conclusion on
decide
anything.
which is correct in this case.
Philosophy's never come to a conclusion about anything. You sure? 100%? They've
Well, I
never
mean,
arrived
there's
at
some
knowledge?
definitional things that they can do, but that's about it.
Just
And that's not
definition?
enough to demonstrate things about reality.
No, they've demonstrated things about reality all the time, long before science showed up on the scene. In fact, they one of the things philosophy demonstrated was that science was a valid tool for truth.
No, it didn't.
Heck,
The success of science and their ability to predict unknown things, that's what demonstrated the truth of the validity of science, not philosophy.
all right. Okay. I'll let you, any last words kind of thing. I think anything that we haven't covered that we need to go over, or I think
Um,
there's nowhere to go. You're,
yeah, I think we just have a two fundamental different understandings of what reality is and what is required to demonstrate something in reality. I don't think that making up a definition, an idea, is enough. You have to take it the next step and actually demonstrate that it is knowledge. You can't just make up an idea and call it knowledge. Um, And I think that when you when you don't have that mechanism to distinguish fact from fiction, if you don't have that mechanism to take your ideas, because some of the ideas that philosophers come up with are really cool. But the problem is that anytime a philosopher shows up on a scientific podcast or anything, inevitably the podcast host says, "Oh, so this is a great idea. How would I go about demonstrating that it's actually true?" And they say, "Oh, I don't know. It's just a great idea." And philosophers come up with awesome ideas. They have their own place in the world. They have their own place in academia. The problem is that when they try to take credit for everything, then it becomes clear that they're just doing that, trying to take credit for things that don't actually matter. So, anyways, I guess that's me.
Right, fair enough. Yeah, I agree that I don't think progress can be had, and I think we've done our best to take it down to the same level and stuff. But yeah, we just have fundamental disagreements on roles of these academic disciplines and stuff like that, and how evidence and argumentation works with respect to rationality and stuff like that. So yeah, there's that fundamental difference. So fair enough. Yeah, I guess kind of recapping what the main point of this is I think despite any heat and stuff towards the later half, we have clearly demonstrated the need for philosophy and the higher role it plays in judging and adjudicating on proper scientific methodology and science as a subdiscipline or a first order discipline, not a subdiscipline, sorry, a first order discipline. And I think on most of the seven facts that I uh, mentioned, that science as a discipline just has to presuppose, we've seen that theism can't explain that. Darren disagrees. I disagree with him. I think we've seen that it can clearly, if true, can explain these features. Whereas on atheism, Darren has been quite clear that you just have to take it as a brute fact or unproven assumption. And that's true. That is what atheistic scientists and science has to do when divorced from philosophy and proper reasoning from other disciplines and stuff like that. So I think I've kind of established the main case as to what this show was meant to be about, and I'm happy with that. But with that said, yeah, have a great week. And even though Darren, I always pull up my hair with you, you're one of my arch nemesis, but I am appreciative that you did show up and you engaged in this good conversation and gave your best to represent the truth.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I feel the same way about you.
I know. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Yep, if I can give it, I can take it. So, all right, cool. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to the audience and that we're here. Next week, we will be having Dr. Paul Copan on to address one of Darren's favorite topics. But the question is: God, the God of the Bible, a moral monster? And we will be answering that question. No, he's not, and it's going to deal with a whole host of things. You know, misogyny in the Old Testament, biblical slavery, is that immoral? Obviously, the killings. You know, God commanding people to kill, is that a moral thing to do? Should you do it or not? And just everything, even weird, kooky, as Paul Copan says, the kooky laws, like the kosher laws. Why would a transcendent God give a rat's patoot about what kind of food I eat and stuff like that? So look
Wow,
forward to
playing
that
around
next.
with the third rail there, huh?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important topic, and Paul's work, his book was very helpful to me and stuff like that. So I think he's one of the best to address that topic. So look forward to that, and yeah, have a great week, everyone.